Today's topic is spiritual tips about facing fear, and I'm recording it, by the way, just so you know. The way they've changed some things with GoToMeeting, which is the service I'm using, it kind of makes sense now to actually post it, where before it would just be a big black screen. And now there's actually something on the screen, so I don't mind putting that onto YouTube now, and then also embedding it on the announcement. So where you originally signed up for is where this recording will go. A lot of what I've said in the past around dealing with any issue is going to show up again. So some of what I say is, for those of you who've been around me for some time, it's not going to be new, but that's always the truth of the spiritual path, is it's not really new. We can create all sorts of interesting new tricks and things and whatnot, but it all comes back to letting go and to trusting and allowing and accepting and all these types of things. And I think you always have to stress that, because I think in this society we've gotten caught up in the latest new fuzzy, glittery, glamorous thing, and we somehow think that newer is better. This is a very much a Western, very much United States level of thinking. Other parts of the world, older is better, and you want to have been in like some house for like generations, and that makes you better somehow. Either way you go, it's ego. And for millennia, people have been facing fear or not facing fear. And so there have been spiritual teachings about it. And I think the thing lately I've been really stressing in my work and with my students is focusing on your actual reality whenever fear is coming up. Like, what is actually happening right now? More often than not, most of our fears, we'll put aside for the time being the times when something that's actually threatening is happening, or more often the case, it's perceived as threatening is happening. But so often the fear we're facing is not actually about anything happening now. When you really start to breathe in and you pause and say, wait, I'm scared about what? What is wrong right now? And you notice, well, I've eaten, I can breathe fresh air, I'm safe, I'm clothed, right? You start to go through the basics, you start to realize that this fear is not really about anything happening right now. A lot of fears, as many of you already know, are very future-oriented. You're looking to the future and you're worrying about something that might happen. And of course, from the ego's perspective, it will happen. Anytime you start saying something will, you are now a fortune teller. And you're probably not right. Right. So anytime you start using the word will, something will happen. That's a good time to notice that the ego's at work. And that's another tip for facing fear before it starts. Because once you get into the world of fortune telling, it's just going to be really uncertain from there on out. And you're probably going to be wrong, but then you're going to threaten and scare yourself around something that you're probably going to be wrong about. Most of the fears that I've ever noticed that I've had have been wrong, have just not happened. In the world of baseball, like, they have a terrible batting percentage. And baseball's funny because, if you get up to the plate and you get on base 3 out of 10 times, that's a good batting average. Fear is even worse if you really start to pay attention to it, and I encourage you to do so. That's another aspect of this. It's another spiritual tip. Pay attention to fear, as opposed to getting lost in it or avoiding it or running away from it, trying to repress it. Give it some attention. Say, wait, what's going on here? What is this really about? Because the more you pay attention to it, the more often you'll realize, wow, this is just wrong. You can fuel fear by giving into exaggerations and leaps in logic. This is something I blogged about today, in the 5 types of ego defenses and traps that you can fall into. And this is going to only fuel the fires of fear when you exaggerate and you create these huge leaps in logic. So what do I mean by that? I mean, going from like, I think I may lose my job, like, so you don't even know if you are, all the way to I'm going to die dead in the gutter, or I'm going to starve to death, or something, right? Because this is a really big leap, and most people don't make quite this big of a leap. I'm using it as an example. But you can, look at your own logic and see how you make these huge leaps. Now, along the way to being dead in the gutter, there's a whole host of assumptions, like you're not going to get another job ever. Nobody's going to come help you, not the government, assistance programs, not family or other friends, or even well-wishing strangers, right? That all that's not going to happen. That's an immediate assumption when you start, working your way all the way down to this other part where you're dead in the gutter. And there's even an assumption that you're going to die in a gutter. Why not on a beach? It could be someplace else entirely. And obviously I'm joking about that, but I'm just pointing to the huge number of assumptions that fuel fear. And when it's fueling fear, like you're just completely caught up, and of course you're not thinking very well either, right? You're actually limiting your ability to reason rationally. So another part of these very simple tips is you stop and you breathe. You start to breathe in when this fear is coming up, to really be with it. See what's coming up and why, and how are you fueling it. Most little fear impulses, we just kind of burst through and burst out and be done, but we recycle them. This is the worst recycling we do. As I often say to my students, like, there's a lot of recycling you should do. You should recycle plastic. There's a lot of it. It should be recycled. You should recycle glass and paper and anything else they know how to recycle. You should do that. You shouldn't recycle fear. It's not healthy. It's not helping the environment. It's not helping your inner environment. It's actually polluting it. This is the recycling that pollutes. Breaking out of these cycles starts with that simpleness of breathing, to pause. Okay, what's going on here? What's really going on here? Right? The very first point I made is like, look at your physical reality. What is actually happening? Are you actually under any kind of actual threat? And the answer for a lot of Westerners in society where we're not under duress around starvation, dehydration, physical threat, doesn't mean it doesn't happen here. But I'm saying, in the very present moment, not even tomorrow, not even 3 hours from now, if you're not sure about where you're going to get your next meal, right? Focus on this moment, because this moment is your key to those next 3 hours, next days, next years down the road. If you get caught up in trying to get to the end, you're going to exhaust yourself, and you're going to get stuck in fear, and you're going to inhibit your ability to actually address any real issues that are going on. My current theory, I don't know how much is theory, but a lot of fear is just meant to juice up your system to fight or to run away. Right? So you get all that pent-up energy, right? That's that animal energy inside that's getting ready to, I have to fight or run away to protect my life. We, however, continue to do this with everything. So we hit that inner response, this fear of like, oh, what if people don't like me, in my new hairstyle? Or what if I do a bad job here, right? And so we create more situations where we're juicing our system up with this fight or flight, which is completely inappropriate to the situations. And this is part of why retraining the mind to actually think logically is really important. This is the important part of the mind. It's like on the spiritual path, I think people often have decided that we're getting rid of the mind. We're going to this no-mind place all the time. And that's not it at all. There's a retraining going on to get us out of these old, very basic survival loops that we don't realize we're in. And so when you look at it with logic, as I said, going back to the I don't have a job, I'm going to end up dead in the gutter sort of thing. It's like, okay, so I don't have a job. What is my physical reality? Well, do I have enough money to eat today? Well, yes, I do. Oh, okay. So that's not a problem. Do I have fresh water, right? This is a big deal. Like, we forget about this in a lot of Western society because we're so fortunate. So, okay, I have clean water that, I can bathe in, I can drink. Oh, no, that's fine. You got fresh air, yes. A roof over your head, yes, right? And as I said, even if some of these things are going to be a problem in the near term, you need your mindfulness and your clarity to take the steps so you can resolve them in the future rather than getting lost in the fear of this moment. And I like using journaling as a tip for dealing with fear as a preemptive attack. It's often more difficult to get into it in any sort of meaningful way when we're triggered. What I mean by being triggered is that the fear is actively happening. This is something that those of us who've been practicing, that later on we can do, and you kind of dissolve the fear from inside out when you're triggered. It's not fun, but you can do it. And the more you do it, then the more empowered you are around it. For most other people, being able to journal it out ahead of time, what am I actually afraid of and why? And don't be satisfied with your first answer for why, because a lot of times your first answer for why is a very poor one. It's your socially taught one. So like if I don't have a job, right, then I need to have a job because I need to have money. Yes, you do need to have the means to get stuff, but the way we weight it is usually too much. And we don't allow other avenues for things to come, because there are people who just give you things if you ask. If you say, like, I'm really hard up for food right now, and I could use a sandwich or an apple, right? You say that to somebody at the grocery store, there's a lot of kindness, right? But if we get caught up in, like, there's only this one way that I can do it, then the other aspect of money is we really limit what we think we can do to earn money. And so out of all these amazing jobs and things all around the world that we could be doing to support ourselves, or the different trades, like some people go on these interesting trips where they're trading their services for room and board around the world, right? These are the many opportunities that are existing for us these days. But in fear, we go into this place where we've limited what we think is possible. So when you're looking at your answer to, like, why I'm afraid of this or that, see if you can start to find your hidden assumptions, what you're keeping out of the equation. And I imagine many of you are keeping a lot of things out of the equation. And that's part of what happens with our egos. And it's really an inappropriate aspect of the ego. Inappropriate in the sense it's not useful. The ego is supposed to be useful. It's just a lens. I say this over and over again. I'll say it over and over again as long as I'm teaching, which I expect to be for some time. But it's a way to have a perspective on life and to sort through tons of information. So to me, it's no different than having a pair of glasses. But I know I'm wearing a pair of glasses, and I know I can put on a different set of glasses if it's more useful. And if your lenses are dirty, if your lenses are too small, or they're an incorrect prescription, maybe that's a better part of the metaphor. Think of your lenses being an incorrect prescription for seeing life clearly. Then you got to change them. I can't earn more money because I'm a waitress, and I'll never be able to do anything else. Well, no, you can do other things. I don't have the time. Sometimes that's true, but a lot of times the I don't have the time is just an excuse for poor time management. It's all sorts of hidden assumptions, and when they're all hiding in the dark and controlling things, they intensify your fear. You really feel like you don't have any options. That things are just going to go down to that dead in the gutter thing again. Or whatever your worst case scenario happens to be. And I encourage you, just sitting here, maybe you should write it down, what your worst case scenario fear is, because this is often driving you and you don't realize it. For some people, it's this fear of being alone. Although some of these things, when you look at them, you start to say, well, am I really scared of being alone? Is that what it's about? And what's so bad about being alone? Those of you who have had any sort of awakening, when you're really in the awakened clear space, you can be all by yourself, but you don't feel alone. You don't feel lonely at all. You feel alive. One thing to notice about fear is it tends to be very exhausting. It will take out a lot of your energy. This happens in awakening as well, because you're getting triggered, you're having all your issues come up, and so there's this inner fear response on top of whatever fear is being processed, and the combination is just exhausting, because you've got the one inappropriate response saying, I'm feeling something I don't know, so I'm scared of it. Right? That's an inappropriate response to something that's just kind of moving out of you. And then you have the old fear that never got processed, that's stuck in you. And so the combination for some of us is you just get exhausted. And that's where you can get into some of the chronic fatigue. That's one of the reasons. There's many reasons for chronic fatigue. Sometimes it's just because you're tired and you've been doing way too much for too long. So another way to look at fear and to deal with it is to see a lot of it as an inappropriate response to 99% of modern day living. And even if somebody holds a gun to your head, it's probably not going to help you to see the situation clearly. The fight or flight or freeze responses are just going to usually get you in more trouble with a situation like that. To have your clarity in a situation where you actually are in physical threat is even more important, which really renders fear as being pretty useless, because it clouds you, doesn't allow you to choose your actions. Your actions are made instinctually or reactively by yourself. And that, as many of you already know, causes all kinds of messes. But at no time do we label our fear as bad. So part of this whole path is embracing everything. And when fear comes, when we embrace fear, when we allow it to be there, but we don't get caught up in the recycling part I was talking about, where we're believing in it and wallowing in it and regurgitating it, and round we go, its energy has to dissipate because we're not keeping it plugged in. So I often use the metaphor of the fan, that when we plug that fan in, we believe in it, we energize it, it's going to go forever. And when we unplug it, if we've been plugged in for a long time, that fan keeps going for some time. And there's a lot of us who are like, well, when's it going to stop? When's it going to stop? So it's going to stop when it's going to stop. Just don't plug it back into the wall again. So if you need a mental image, next time you find yourself worrying, that's great, because the minute you notice, that is awareness. You've taken a little bit of a step back to notice that you're caught up in fear. And that's unplugging the fan. Just understand that you've kept it plugged back in again, which means it's going to need more time to unwind, to release. So some of the tips we've talked about. Focus on your physical reality. Usually when we focus on our physical reality, there is no immediate threat warranting fear, and it really is all in our heads. Bring logic back to bear. Look at your assumptions, because what we usually are thinking is our logic or common sense isn't logic and common sense at all. And so you have to start to unwind some of those things to say, like, oh, why am I so worried about money all the time? Why am I always worried about being in a relationship all the time? Why am I always worried about the relationship I'm currently in all the time? Because if you can start to unwind the hidden assumptions there, then some of the other fears around, like, oh, I can't lose this relationship, or oh, I have to have money, or oh, I have to get into a relationship, those fears start to lose the weight, lose the strength behind them, because a lot of the underlying assumptions you can now see, and you don't necessarily believe in them. If you do keep believing in them, then they'll get worse. So journal ahead of time. So, as I said, is another tip. Get out ahead of the next fear wave, because it'll come, because in the society we've taught ourselves to be so scared of so many things that it's better to be prepared. Be like, okay, so I know some of my triggers and some of my things, some of the different fears that I have. And so it'll be that much easier for you to identify when you're getting caught up in another fear. You can stick with that fear of the future. That's such a common thing. A lot of the ego operates in what can I get? And a lot of the fear around that comes from the ego is not getting that thing. And it can be a thing, can be a dress, can be a relationship, can be a job, these types of things where the ego fixates on and it's worried about losing. So the question always comes back to is like, well, if you lose it, then what? Right? And just really be persistent with that then what question. You have to knock out all the pins underneath it, because whenever fear comes in the moment, it's just such a strong thing. And it's a strong, powerful emotion. It's a biochemical reaction inside us. That's, as I said, juicing us up, ready for action to do something. So we start to work on knocking the pins out from underneath that ego response, the understanding how we view ourselves and how we view life. A lot of people view life as a threat. That everything going on in life is a threat to them that they have to prepare for. And the more they're into that sort of space of seeing life in that way, the greater anxiety and fear somebody tends to have. And if somebody's had trauma earlier on in life, there's a lot of fear already in that system that wants to come up. So it's like a larger landmine that something can trigger, and then that thing starts to blow up, which makes more of life seem more threatening. That's the horrible thing about trauma, is people start to see solely through this lens of fear that everything is going to get to them. It's going to do something bad to them, when that's simply the echoes of that deeper pain that's stuck and needs to be resolved. It's not actually true to the situation around. The unfortunate part is the more pain and more fear we have inside, the more we tend to call in those situations to bring this issue out. We do it unconsciously. There's very rarely the person who goes, oh, I'm going to call in a new rapist or something to deal with my sexual abuse. No, we're not talking about that. And it's horrible when that does happen, and it can happen when we have these pains inside that are undealt with. It just skews our vision. It creates these situations that are backwards with trauma in particular. It can flip the wires in the sense that the people who are healthy for us, we don't think are healthy. The people who are unhealthy for us, we think are healthy. And that's the horrible thing about a lot of traumas, especially with like childhood sexual abuse and things like that. It's flipped the wires, because the people who are supposed to be good to you and take care of you in that family setting are doing the abuse, and they're the unhealthy ones. Coincidentally, on the other side is when people who've got this deep pain inside, right? This is all triggering a whole lot of fear in people all the time. So that's why I'm talking about it. Then when they get around somebody who's healthy, in an interesting way, like that deeper love and connection wants to come up, can often push on that old pain. And so when that pain gets activated in that way with this person who's potentially new, and also a healthy connection, there's a tendency to run away from that type of a person. So as you grow as a person and get to know yourself and come down the spiritual path, you start to be able to better identify too when certain types of fear need to be leaned into specifically. This is really important, because some of these fears are actually saying that there's something I really want, or this feels really good, and there's all this inner pressure that for whatever reason doesn't believe you're good enough to have it, or needs to be addressed first before you can have that connection that gets pushed up out of the well and has to be dealt with. This needs to be leaned into. And in the spaces of trauma and abuse, it needs to be leaned into very mindfully, with a lot of conscious awareness. And this is where it's a whole other topic to get into, around how you set up kind of that crucible of love to allow you to break down and work through some really difficult, painful things without getting caught up projecting onto new people in your life and so on and so forth. And it happens a lot just with something more simple, that the very job somebody wants is the very thing they're scared of. Right? This really illuminates these I'm not worthy issues that a lot of people carry. And so this is another thing where you lean into, you say, no, I'm going to take this job. And that will ignite more of those fears around I'm not good enough, and right? And so you keep breathing into it and understand that as you're breathing into it, you're defusing some old stories that are not healthy for you. These are inappropriate fears. They're not serving you. They're actually keeping you out of things that you actually want. Jobs, relationships, and things like that. That's one of the interesting things where somebody goes like, what do I do? What do I do? It's like, follow your heart. How many times do I need to say? Just follow your heart and see where it takes you. And the more fear you have around doing whatever, a videographer job or becoming a producer, the more fear there is there, the more I encourage you to lean into it to see what the fear is really about. Because a lot of times you're going to find out it's actually keeping you from something you really do want and that really does matter to you. So the simple tip out of all that is lean into fear. Along with the breathing into it, to diffuse it, leaning into it, to know what it is. So there's that quality of curiosity with that leaning in. It's like, what is this? Especially when, you've used logic. Logic you've looked at, it's like applying for a producer job or whatever, whatever that your example happens to be, is in no way a threat to you. Right? So there's no real reason for the fear to be there. And the better you get with your own logic, you can start to weed out the irrational fears that come up that are just absolutely absurd or irrelevant to the situation, right? So here's an irrational fear. It's like, well, what's going to happen at my old job? It's like, well, they'll figure it out, right? That's an irrational fear if you really want this producing job. Or I don't know if they'll accept me. It's like, well, that's an irrational fear as well, because you won't know until you get there. And you don't know if anybody anywhere will ever accept you anyhow. So that's also irrelevant. It seems to be an element of this webinar today that I'm really emphasizing the mind, that the mind is a powerful and wonderful tool. We just have to understand how to use it. A lot of what it tells us isn't right. This whole ego personality that's just been running amok and is built out of all sorts of things we saw from other people as we grew up. And what other situations, good, bad, and indifferent, have come along to help form that. Another tip to working through your fears is continuing to open your perspective, which I've already touched on. Let your perspective broaden. If you have trouble with this is a good reason to work with a spiritual teacher. It's a good reason to talk to friends, ask people about your blind spots, take a travel outside the country, right? Getting into different spaces where you can see more clearly, getting out of your daily life for a little bit can be useful as well, right? That's why a lot of people like to spend like a week off in nature. They just feel so much clearer when you get outside the human energy, which often is operating at the vibration of fear. One of the things that I encourage all of you to look for is the deeper cultural statement that you are not good enough. A lot of Western culture is simply telling you over and over that you are not good enough. Doesn't really say for what. There's an assumption in there that you're going to get something really great if you are good enough, if you do something. Right? And so we presume that all the things that we're seeing, like you're supposed to have a family, a spouse, you're supposed to have a good paying job, a house, a cat, maybe a couple dogs, right? We see these things. And they're thrown at us as like, this is how to do it. And a lot of people will get all those things and realize they still don't feel good enough. So, well, you need to be stylish, in shape, a certain type of shape too. It's not just in shape. It's not your natural shape that I talk about. It's a certain type of shape, right? Women are supposed to look a certain way, like the supermodel thing. And guys are now all supposed to be bodybuilders. You see how ridiculous this is, but a lot of us have all bought into it. And I want you to understand this is all stemming from probably a couple of things, but one of the big ones is the statement that you are not good enough, and it's a complete lie. And it's one of the fundamental lies that needs to be dealt with because it's going to underpin a huge number of fears. It's another thing for you to understand in your own space, to journal about, so that you understand what your brain of I'm not good enough is. Whether it's your looks, whether it's social climbing or social relationships or money, or the usual ones. I don't need to keep telling you this, right? And this goes back to the general tip of knocking out the pins from underneath fear. Leaning into fear, breathing into it, it's also part of just having courage. Courage in knowing that you can be with any of your emotions. Because it seems to me, more often than not, we're actually more afraid of our own emotions than just about anything else that's going on in the external world. And the strange things about that, right, is we're afraid of fear. You see the problem with that, because if you're afraid of it, then you're already feeling it. So you just kind of fuel the cycle. I'm afraid of fear, so I won't feel it. So you repress other parts of it. And so it just gets worse and worse, where you keep avoiding your own feelings. And you keep recreating the feeling that you don't want to feel. This is a very common thing. It's a catch-22 of what the fear and the ego are doing. Because they're trying to protect you from feeling bad feelings, essentially. Because you don't think you can handle them. And we're not really taught how to handle them in a lot of society. They're not telling too many little kids in class, just cry it out. Just work through it, process it. Stamp your feet, wave your arms, shake your head, you're good, okay. It's walk it off, stuff it down. Just endure the pain until you collapse, die of a heart attack in your 80s, 70s, 60s, wherever. It's really kind of bleak at times. And if nothing else, what happens is the embittering process, which I blogged about a couple weeks ago. That's where you just keep getting harder and harder and harder because you're more and more afraid of feeling your feelings. And you're afraid that life will trigger something, and it will. So life gets smaller and smaller and smaller and narrower and narrower. People become hateful in those spaces and do terrible things or speak terrible things. It's really an important thing to be able to deal with your own fear. Keeps you open in a deeper space of love. You feel alive, which is what pretty much everyone really wants. It's another aspect to look at in yourself is what do you really want. It's not so much for dealing with fear, not directly anyway, but in general it's an important question is what do you want? And it's another situation where you can't be satisfied with the initial answer because the initial answer that you will have has been taught, and probably the second one too, and maybe even the third one. Because I can tell you that what the ultimate answer probably is you just want to feel alive. And aliveness has a quality of, at times, peace, has the overt qualities of love and kindness. When I'm talking about love, I'm often speaking in the higher truth, which accepts everything, not necessarily just the good feelings. But fear does the opposite of that. Although some people learn to feel a sense of aliveness through excitement, where they kind of try and twist their fears into something they enjoy, but it's still a very depleting sort of emotion. If anyone has any questions that are bubbling up, feel free to put them into the chat pod. Excuse me. And I'll keep emphasizing the leaning into fear, to being curious about what's coming up inside. A lot of times you will know what it is, and other times you won't. There's a lot of stuff that gets trapped down into ourselves from childhood that we don't realize is there that will show up. Hi, Julia. Good to hear from you. Does excitement sometimes mask fear? Actually, to me, that is just fear. It's just fear you've interpreted as fun. Right, so there's excitement of bungee jumping, there's excitement of winning a race, which is kind of a release, right? You know, release of the fear because before you were afraid you were going to lose the race. There's the excitement of a sporting game, right? You know, and you wouldn't feel excited about it if you were at all concerned that your team didn't win. In fact, like nobody likes the game, where it seems like the one team is just beating the bejesus out of the other. So there's no excitement to it, right? There's no fear of an outcome not happening a certain way. So most of my experience with excitement is that it's a masking of fear. It's an agitated state. It's not necessarily all bad. There can be a lot of fear in like first getting to know somebody as a romantic interest, but we often turn that into excitement, usually because we're assuming that it's going to turn out well, whatever that means for you. And then it can quickly switch, right? That's the other side of like fear, is like it'll quickly switch from excitement into like that sort of dread and fear of the future. It's like, oh, I think this person's going to reject me and I'm not going to get what I want. The deeper you drop into these inner spaces, the more you sit in these places of peace. You don't get too high or too low. And that feels really good. After a while, a lot of the excitement and agitation doesn't feel as good as like it first did. Before, it was just kind of a nice outlet for fear. We just didn't realize we were doing that. Didn't realize how much we needed outlets to get rid of fear and to let off steam. Thanks for the question, Julia. What else is on people's minds? leaning into fear is definitely an acquired trait because it's not what we're taught, as I said. The more you do it, though, the more empowering it becomes. The more quickly you start to notice, here's fear coming up. What am I actually afraid of here? And you start to actually go towards the thing that you're afraid of, whatever the situation may be. It could be towards that person that you're really attracted to, but all this fear came up around being in that connection. It could be towards doing a whole bunch of different things. Doesn't mean you're always charging down the battlements to find the next fear. You don't need to do that. But it is actually a great indicator of where you need to go. Some of the things that you're most passionate about, like people always like, what's my purpose? I'm like, yeah, I don't know, right? You get these questions. And I don't think in terms of purpose the way most people do. Usually what's ever most meaningful to you in your soul's journey often has the most fear in front of it. I have another question to me. It says, I realize that being myself comes with a lot of fear, and I wonder if there's a way to be an entrepreneur, make enough to support myself and be myself. And their answer, of course, is yes, but I think you have a lot of hidden assumptions. Right, so this goes back to using your own logic to kind of unearth these assumptions around how you want to do this thing or how you think it should look versus playing the process to let something evolve naturally. There's a lot of ideas around what you think is meaningful to you and what is actually meaningful to you. And a lot of times what we think is initially meaningful to us is just a way to avoid this statement, like I said before, of I am not good enough. See, the beautiful thing about the spiritual path is you don't have to do anything to be. You don't have to do anything to be because you're already here. That is in and of itself its own purpose. You don't have to help tons of orphans. You don't have to be a president. You don't have to be a mom. You don't have to be anybody. You just get to be. And from that space of being, that is the fertile soil where things want to grow. They just do. And so my general encouragement towards people is to clear the land. It's always right. Clear the land. Clear of these ideas of who you are. See where fear is really hold up and dig it out. Figure it out. Because that's making space for the soil, for the seeds inside you to start to grow on their own. And then trust the process. When the seed starts to sprout in your life and it's your poetry, it's your compassion, it's social work, it's going to another country, right? A lot of times there's going to be a lot of fear around going to do these things. So you go and you start to nourish them little by little and play the process and see what you need in that moment. Being in the present moment is such a powerful tool so you don't get caught up in that fear of like, how is this going to look in 20 days or 30 days or 30 years from now? It's like, you don't know. None of us do. So the question of how do I support myself now, that's a good one. But I think the deeper question is, how do I expand my perspective, at least for you in the question I've got here, it was sent to me privately. Because I think as you open up your perspective on yourself, you're going to see a lot more opportunities than perhaps the ones you're currently pursuing. Thank you for the question. Hi, Michelle. Even though realizing my fear is not rational, it's difficult to undo the program that brought me to this state. Well, don't try to undo it. Just look at it. Have a steering contest with it, Michelle. See who blinks. Don't let it be you, though. Just keep looking at that fear that's trying to program you to be scared, trying to tell you that you need to be scared now. It's a funny thing that will happen because what happens is you for a while feel like these two people. You feel like this other person in front is just completely out of whack, right, having this upset fear. And then another part of you, though, this way I feel it feels like I'm just kind of step back watching this other person just beat themselves up or roll around in fear for a while. But the longer you allow yourself for that space of presence, the witness that we're always talking about, something happens here where something eventually has to break down. It has to stop. And this is where your logic can come into, where you start to say, okay, so is this in any way rational to this current moment? Right? Present moment, rational logic, breathing in, witnessing it. It's like 4 of the tips. See what happens. And it may be that, as I said, the fan has been plugged in for a long time, Michelle. And all the biochemicals are very real things. They're not just thoughts. This is another aspect of appreciating fear. It's a powerful, powerful tool. It's been keeping our species alive for millennia because that was a way to get the instinctual body to take action. You flood it with this and it runs into or fights. That's what it does. And so take the important steps of stepping out of it and not recycling in the bad way, right? No inner pollution. Thanks for the comment and question. Hi, Esther. How do you know if someone is good for you? I feel like following joy has often landed me in unhealthy situations, so I feel wary about just following my feelings. Well, I think that kind of speaks to what we were talking, some of our other sessions together, Esther, and what I was talking about with flipped wires. That when it feels like, you know, our initial impressions of people close to us have been hurtful in a lot of ways, like those tend to be kind of put in that sense of being what's healthy. And so that's kind of where we think joy should be, when a lot of times it hasn't been. And in return, like people who seem kind of more scarier, right? Those actually may be healthy relationships, and that may be the fear that you have to lean into. I really can't give you a more specific answer to that because it's part of your own journey to kind of figure it out. And that involves taking risks and seeing, you know, mindful risks, right? You know, where you start to feel through what's going on, you learn to communicate more, and you hopefully can find a few good people and friends, partners that will communicate back with you. And that will actually be a sign, like if you're finding someone who's pretty decent, to help you unwind like these inner patterns that seem to bring you into unhealthy situations, and help you better identify, well, what's unhealthy and what's not. What's me projecting that this is unhealthy when it's not, right? And it's just my own fear of intimacy showing up. Let me know if that was useful, Esther. Hi, Carrie. Especially right now, I have a great awareness of some relationships where I do not fit in, seeing how I want everyone to accept me. Fear of not being real, being too spiritual. Example, when they're complaining, carrying others down, I really do not desire to join in. I feel like an outsider, conflicted with letting these relationships go, or do I live my truth? Well, I think the issue is that on an inner level, you have chosen to feel like an outsider, which means there's something you want from them in terms of connection. And all connection is ultimately inside us. It really is that simple. Spiritual path, we rely on other people to do anything in any way pleasurable or interesting, so long as it's not physically damaging. A lot of it we have to let go. And just keep noticing how you allow yourself to feel alive and connected to yourself. It's part of what fear does is it'll come in and say, nope, I'm not allowed to feel good until something else, till I find a new connection, till they accept me or validate me, right? And that's actually your own inner process where you've just said, I'm not allowed to feel good until the external world does something else. And there are countless situations that I talk to people about, and it's all the same thing. It's just you cutting yourself off from feeling you. And everything is spiritual, by the way. The deeper you drop into connection with yourself, even the complaining is part of it. You just may not want to enjoy the conversation or be a part of it. Thanks for the question and comment, Carrie. Right, and the not good enough thing is still hiding there too, right? That's why I keep pointing to it. It's like when we are at peace with ourselves, we don't need anybody to have any kind of conversation around us. We don't. But if we don't feel like we're good enough, then suddenly we're in the game of needing validation, love, better conversations, more spiritual people around us, and all those types of things. And I really do take exception with that. I need more spiritual people in life because usually that's coming from nothing but ego. It doesn't mean it's not nice to connect with people who have a certain level of awareness on the journey. That's why many of you are here sitting in this webinar. And that's cool. That's fine. But when we start to blame other people for not being good enough, that's nothing but ego. And it's usually showing that we haven't done much work for ourselves yet either, because we're trying to find like a new down comforter to wrap ourselves in, a new community to feel safe and secure and validated, and hide all the deeper issues such as I am not good enough. I have heard this theme said so many times in so many ways about friends, about partners, repeatedly about partners. Give it a rest. Your partner is as they are. If they're abusive in some way, leave them, right? You know, that tends to be the thing. Leave them mindfully as best you can, especially if you have a family. But otherwise, so long as they're either neutral to supportive, work with what you got and work on your own issues first. That's my general advice. But, you know, you have to find your own way. And the more you lean into fear, you just realize how much of it really doesn't exist, like we've talked about. There's nothing keeping you from the things that really matter to you but you. And I'm not talking about some ridiculous dream to be the first person to live on Mars or something like that, right? You know, that's nice. The present moment is the moment that matters most. Being here now, just allowing yourself to be fully here, alive, in connection with yourself. Hi, Esther. I feel baffled. Perhaps I just need to let things play out. There's one person who's been so far super nice, but I feel doubtful and suspicious. Maybe that is a fear of intimacy. That would be my initial guess, but there's no rush either. That's another good part about the spiritual path. It teaches us patience. If somebody's a good partner for us, you just slowly take time, practice communicating, developing all these skills if they're new to you, and see what comes up. Right? Super nice, right? This is to me is part of like the flipped wires. It's like if you're so used to people always being cynical and mean and hard and emotionally abusive and things like that, then somebody's super nice, right? That suspicious thing comes up because for one reason it's new, and it's not what the people who've been a big part of your life have been doing. And in the past, probably with like people, anytime that happened in the scenarios that you grew up in with, that super nice was usually short-lived and usually came with some other sort of kick in the teeth. And so that creates this whole sort of fear of intimacy and, you know, suspicion. Someone respects your boundaries. As I said, these flipped wires are a pain in the ass. So you just go slow, though, because the good people will stick around. They'll care about you. And you're worth it. What other questions do people have? We have about 10 minutes left together. By the way, for those of you who may have noticed or may not have noticed, I'm starting to do some blogs, like some new ones on Wednesdays as well, kind of every other Wednesday, where Monday is always like my main day for whatever new post I'm putting up. Every other Wednesday I've been doing a full-length blog, and then the other Wednesdays, those are the blog announcements for the next ones that are coming up. And so the one that went up today is the 5 ego defenses and traps you need to know. Some of which I've pointed to today, like exaggerating and the leaps of logic. So it should be coming up on your screen. So here it is, 5 ego defenses and traps you need to know. For anybody who's new or would otherwise like to help support me, since these are free webinars, I'm always happy to receive donations, and here's the donation button in the blog. Right above the free newsletter subscription. If you're not on the newsletter, feel free to do so. You can always unsubscribe. It's not hard. One of the big lessons, in working with me for a lot of my students is leaning into fear of connection, because that's what I offer. It's also leaning into dealing with parts of yourself that you haven't wanted to look at. Because I often remind people, it's like, I don't really need you to do or be anyone for me, and I'm just here to help you see the truth. So in situations like this that are very healthy, it's like if there's any part of you that's afraid, then that's a fear to lean into or to call out, especially in the presence of someone like me, because that's part of my work. It's like to help people look at fear and to bring it out, because when it hides in the shadows, it's going to have power over you. When it's seen in the light, it often just breaks down and disappears because it doesn't make any sense. Much of fear only makes sense in the dark when you're not looking at it. When you look at it and you bring your own divine light and wisdom to it, it just dissolves because it doesn't make any sense. And so the original example I was talking about of not losing a job and then dying cold and alone, dead in the gutter, like when you start to look at that with your own logic, you're like, wow, this doesn't make any sense. And I already know a bunch of people who can help tap me into like some other places to potentially find jobs, and there's all sorts of things I can do in interim. It's just amazing how quickly fear breaks down when you look at it. Which is kind of the fundamental tip in all this. The fundamental spiritual tip is to look at fear. Don't get lost in it, just look at it. It's that staring contest I suggest to Michelle. It's like, there it is. It's trying to tell you that something bad's going to happen. Sometimes it won't even tell you what the bad thing is. You're just scared. And you're like, okay, so what are you scared of? And you'll stop and you'll think, I actually don't know. What am I afraid of? And then maybe you'll come up with something. And then you start to do what I suggested in your journal. You just ask, well, why are you afraid of that? What's going to happen? And then you answer that question, and then you answer the next one. Well, why are you afraid of that? And it is true that in many respects we are afraid of nothing. But there's nothing to be afraid of. But as I also said, we also acknowledge the physiology of the body and the fear chemicals that go with that. And you can research that if you want to get into the hormones and the neurotransmitters that flood your system with fear, when fear is happening. And you just honor that. That's powerful stuff, powerful juice. I have another comment in private. I found that I love just being, but finding it hard to connect that with making a living. I found that I use spiritual as a way to not handle situations like dealing with money and the like, using being as a way to just present, but also avoiding dealing with things, people, and bills. So then I try to just fix it and try all sorts of things to fix my situation. Is there fear behind that, you think? Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of that is just hiding out in the high state feeling. So I don't even call what you're talking about being. I call that a high state experience. The high state experience is kind of like floating up here, which feels fantastic for a while, but it doesn't deal with the deeper issues in the body. The issues around who you think you really are and what it means to live a good life, what it means to live a safe life. It doesn't deal with the cultural unconscious of varying levels. And we all have different varying levels of cultural unconscious that come all the way down from the Western society level to, for those of us in America, the American level to our state level. Like there's definitely a California state consciousness over here. And then there's the San Francisco Bay Area consciousness, which is different than the California one. And then, I mean, there's a certain level of consciousness with the Pleasant Hill. It's not where I was born, so I wouldn't say that's a defining one for me. But like if you go to San Francisco or Berkeley, whole ego over in those two places about themselves. All those things don't want to be dealt with. And they define how you see yourself and what you think is possible. And so that's always the encouragement. The deeper you go, you have to start to look into these parts of you that, and all the different cultural thoughts you have around money. Because that will define how you see what money is good money to make, right? Because we have a lot of judgments around what kind of money we want to make, and where we want to make it, and how we want to make it. which is pretty ridiculous. Outside of heavy weapons manufacture, chemical weapons, selling drugs, and prostituting yourself, most money, the sources kind of doesn't matter that much. So those are some more thoughts to work with, but it's just an encouragement to go deeper, my dear. You're welcome. So any last questions? I'm glad it was very helpful, Michelle. We've got time for one more. Speak now, forever hold your peace, or at least until the next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks. So go back to the 10:30 a.m. for anyone who's new. The 10:30 a.m. is my conceit to my friends in Europe and the UK, so they don't have to get up at 2 in the morning to watch one of these. I'm going to be talking about spiritual awakening stages. I don't usually get into too much of that because people think too linearly about it. It's not like you go from A to B to C to D. It's more like you kind of spiral. then you kind of spiral into something new. So cycles and stages and things like that will be what I'm talking about on April 22nd at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. Well, it sounds like this is it for tonight. So thank everyone for joining me. It's a pleasure, as always. Please use what is useful. Let the rest wash away. That's just my experience. And I always want you to be developing your own wisdom with all of this. Take care.